Abraham Lincoln entered history as the man who saved the Union and abolished slavery. His portrait today is a symbol of honesty, courage, and justice. But in his own time, not everyone saw him as a hero. For many, he was a threat, a betrayer of tradition, a man willing to shatter the old order for the sake of his ideas. When Lincoln took office in 1861, the country was already teetering on the brink of civil war. Southern states were seceding one by one, declaring independence from the Union. Yet few realized that beyond the visible political struggle, in the shadows, secret societies were already plotting. And for them, Abraham Lincoln was not just a political adversary, he was enemy number one. Among the most infamous of these was the so-called Order of the Golden Circle. On the surface, it appeared to be a patriotic Southern fraternity, devoted to defending slavery and promoting the expansion of slaveholding territories. But in truth, it was something far darker, a tightly organized network with its own symbols, rituals, and blood oaths of secrecy. Its ultimate goal was chilling, nothing less than the creation of a vast empire of slavery, stretching from the American South through Mexico and into the Caribbean. Lincoln's determination to halt the spread of slavery and ultimately to destroy it made him the single greatest obstacle to their dream. Even before the tragedy at Ford's Theater, whispers of assassination attempts trailed Lincoln like shadows. Newspapers of the day recorded rumors that his life was in danger from the moment he was elected. In 1861, as he traveled by train to his inauguration, Baltimore was the site of a sinister plot. Members of the order allegedly planned to intercept the train and kill him before he could take the oath of office. The scheme was foiled only because Allan Pinkerton's detectives uncovered it in time and spirited Lincoln through the city in secret, disguised and under heavy guard. The plot's failure was public knowledge, but what was less known, and what later researchers discovered in archives, was even more disturbing. Documents from the late 19th and early 20th centuries reveal symbols within the order's correspondence that were not of Southern invention. They were European, emblems and sigils associated with old Masonic lodges across the Atlantic. This raised a troubling possibility. Lincoln was not merely confronting homegrown fanatics, but a transnational web of secret organizations whose influence stretched beyond America's borders. The strongest clue comes from a cryptic entry in the private diary of Senator Henry Wilson, one of Lincoln's most loyal allies. In a passage dated 1862, he wrote, "Tonight I overheard their whispers. They say the order has found allies among those who wear black aprons and worship the circle. They mean to remove him. I do not know how to warn him. Who were these men in black aprons? Masons? Foreign agents? Something else entirely? And what did it mean to worship the circle?" The symbolism of the circle appeared again and again in scattered records, sometimes in connection with European lodges, sometimes in the rituals of Southern cults like the Golden Circle, and sometimes in strange places where religion and politics blurred. But the most unsettling discovery is this. Traces of these networks did not remain confined to the rebellious South. Several reports, now buried deep in the archives of Washington, suggest that members of these societies had infiltrated the capital itself. Some were clerks, others were military officers, and a few even moved in the very halls of Congress. If true, this meant that Lincoln was encircled not only by an open rebellion in the South, but by a secret enemy embedded at the very heart of the Union government. Was the Civil War only a clash of armies, or was it also a hidden war of symbols, oaths, and secret alliances? For Lincoln, the line between politics and conspiracy blurred more with each passing year. And if the Order of the Golden Circle truly stood behind the plots against him, then his assassination in 1865 may have been not just the act of a lone fanatic, but the fulfillment of a plan decades in the making, carried out by forces far more powerful than the history books ever admit. The Order of the Golden Circle was officially born in 1854. Its founder was George Bickley, doctor, self-styled intellectual, and adventurer. To the public, he projected the image of a respectable scholar, but inside burned a fanaticism bordering on madness. Bickley preached that America's destiny was not merely to preserve slavery, but to transform it into the cornerstone of a new empire. That empire, he claimed, would stretch far beyond the plantations of the South. It would encompass Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean islands, an endless ring of tropical lands, a golden circle where slave labor would fuel unimaginable wealth and unchallenged power. On the surface, the vision seemed utopian to its supporters, insane to its critics. Yet the order grew rapidly. Within a few years, tens of thousands had joined its ranks. Members wore special rings, engraved with a sun inside a circle, swore blood oaths in candlelit rooms, and vowed secrecy unto death. Surviving descriptions of their rituals speak of dark chambers, salt circles traced across floors, incantations, read in a strange mixture of English and Latin. But the order was not merely a sect of dreamers. It was a network, political, military, and financial. Its members wormed their way into city councils, into state legislatures, into supply chains for weapons and food. When the Civil War broke out, the order played a hidden hand, running secret stockpiles, smuggling contraband, sabotaging railroads, even plotting raids deep into Union territory. Lincoln understood the threat. As early as 1861, he tasked the Pinkerton Detective Agency with infiltrating and monitoring the order. One surviving report, rediscovered in the 20th century, warned starkly, "The order is everywhere. Baltimore, Louisville, Cincinnati, New Orleans. Their aim is disorder, sabotage, and the removal of the president. They believe his death will open their path." It was this very intelligence that led to one of the most dramatic episodes of Lincoln's life, the secret rerouting of his inaugural journey. Originally scheduled to appear publicly in Baltimore, he was instead smuggled through the city at night, under heavy guard and in disguise. Without that intervention, Lincoln's first assassination attempt might have come not in 1865, but in March 1861. Yet the deeper one looks, the darker the picture grows. A Pinkerton agent named Timothy Webb, who successfully infiltrated a chapter of the order, left chilling notes. They do not merely speak of war, they practice rites. They draw a circle, divide it into four, and place in the center a child's doll. They say, without sacrifice, there is no victory. The same details surface again in independent reports. In 1862, Louisville police raided a clandestine meeting hall and discovered on the floor a chalk circle marked into quadrants, with 4 candles at the edges and a small wooden cross placed at its center. What are we to make of this? For some historians, these rituals were theater, intimidation tactics for initiates. But for others, the symbolism is impossible to ignore, especially because the exact same emblem, a circle divided into 4, appears decades earlier in records connected to the so-called Sisters of Taylor, the mysterious twins said to haunt the shadows of American politics. The possibility is unsettling. Was the Golden Circle simply a political conspiracy of slaveholders? Or had it become absorbed into something larger, a cult whose rituals and symbols predated the Civil War, whose very existence blurred the line between politics and the occult? Evidence of that connection emerges most dramatically in a letter discovered in the 1930s, written by George Bickley himself and sent to a confidant in Texas. In it, he wrote, "All will be decided when he falls. The circle will close. The empire will begin." The wording left little doubt. The he in question, the figure whose death would complete the circle, was none other than Abraham Lincoln. If that is true, then John Wilkes Booth's gunshot at Ford's Theater was not the impulsive act of a lone zealot. It was the endgame of a design years in the making, a design in which the Order of the Golden Circle played a central role. By the beginning of 1862, Abraham Lincoln had come to a chilling realization. His enemies were not only on the battlefields of Virginia and Tennessee. Secret societies, born in the South and spreading into the border states, were steadily worming their way into the very heart of Washington, D.C. The Order of the Golden Circle, the so-called Sons of Liberty, and even branches of European Masonic lodges were said to have their agents in Congress, in government offices, and, most disturbingly, even among the president's own guards. The first warning sign came in the form of a man who would later become infamous, Officer John Parker. In 1865, Parker would be assigned to guard Lincoln at Ford's Theater, only to abandon his post at the decisive moment. What few realize is that 3 years earlier, Parker had already been flagged by Pinkerton detectives. Reports alleged that he maintained contact with a group known as the Southern Brothers, a fraternity long suspected of being a front for the Golden Circle itself. Lincoln knew this, and yet he had little choice. His presidency was plagued by the uncomfortable truth that he could never place complete trust in anyone. His closest aide, John Nicolay, wrote in one letter, "He often says, 'I am surrounded by shadows.' He smiles when he says it. But I know. He understands that among us walk those who wish to see him dead." The paranoia was not unfounded. Around the same time, Washington was shaken by the scandal of Senator Jesse Brighton, accused of maintaining ties with the order. Newspapers published excerpts of letters in which Brighton referenced a great circle to which all must serve. The scandal was hushed up swiftly, yet only weeks later, Brighton was quietly inducted into a private Masonic lodge, rumored to include several powerful politicians. The Pinkertons pressed on, collecting intelligence with growing urgency. One particularly disturbing report, rediscovered in the 1920s, described the hidden life of the capital. We have established that no fewer than 3 secret clubs operate in Washington. Their members gather at night in the basements of hotels and theaters. Their emblem is a circle divided into 4. They speak of sacrifice. The president's name is invoked again and again. Lincoln, always a man of measured composure, began to show signs of strain. He stayed late in his study, scrawling long letters, only to burn them in the fireplace. He spoke in fragments to his family and staff, leaving behind eerie confessions. One servant later recalled hearing him murmur to his wife, Mary, "If they kill me, know this. It will not be Booth. It will be those who have played the game for years." Such words never appeared in official transcripts or speeches, but whispers of them survived in the oral recollections of household staff. The paradox was cruel. Even among his generals and advisors were men rumored to have once attended Masonic lodges, institutions now tightly entangled with the networks of the Golden Circle. Were these merely coincidences? Or was Washington itself infiltrated, its very leadership compromised by forces that dreamed of reshaping America from the shadows? Historians remain divided. Yet one truth is difficult to deny. Lincoln governed in an atmosphere of siege. He was fighting not only Jefferson Davis's Confederacy, but also an invisible enemy whose reach extended into the corridors of the White House itself. Against this backdrop, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln ceases to resemble a lone fanatic's lucky shot. Instead, it emerges as the final act of a script years in the making, a script written by men in dark rooms, tracing circles in salt, and whispering oaths over flickering candles. And Lincoln himself seemed to sense it. In private moments, he left behind fragments, dark, prophetic words that suggest he foresaw not only his death, but the shadowed hands that would deliver it. In the next chapter, we will look closely at those prophecies, dreams, letters, and chilling testimonies that reveal how Abraham Lincoln seemed to know the end was coming long before the shot rang out at Ford's Theater. Abraham Lincoln always struck his contemporaries as a man of somber temperament. His biographers often wrote of his melancholy nature, of his tendency to withdraw into long silences, to speak of fate, mortality, and the brevity of life. Yet in the final years of his life, something darker began to take hold, something that went beyond the ordinary weight of his responsibilities. In the spring of 1865, just weeks before his death, Lincoln described a dream to his closest friends that would later chill the nation. In the dream, he wandered through the White House and found it draped in mourning. In the East Room stood a coffin, covered by a flag. Soldiers stood at attention while citizens filed past, many of them weeping. Lincoln asked one of the guards, "Who has died in the White House?" The soldier replied, "The President. He was killed by an assassin." This account was preserved by his friend and bodyguard, Ward Hill Layman, who later swore that Lincoln retold the dream in vivid, disturbing detail. Within weeks, the dream would become reality. But that was not the first time Lincoln experienced such visions. 2 years earlier, in January 1863, at a time when Union armies were suffering devastating defeats, Lincoln confided to his wife Mary that he had seen something unsettling in the mirror. He saw his own reflection doubled. One face was vibrant and alive, the other pale and corpse-like. Mary took it as an omen, that he would be elected to a second term, but that he would not survive to complete it. To many contemporaries, these were nothing more than the exhausted hallucinations of a man under unimaginable stress. But when placed alongside the uncanny accuracy of later events, the coincidences are far more disturbing. Context makes the picture darker still. Lincoln knew he was the target of secret societies. Pinkerton agents constantly warned him of the Order of the Golden Circle, a clandestine organization plotting against him. He knew there were men in Congress who whispered openly of his removal. Against this backdrop, his dreams and visions take on a haunting resonance, as though his subconscious was not merely anxious, but tuned into the danger circling closer. Historians still debate whether Lincoln's dreams were products of his mind or something more. To skeptics, they were the predictable result of a weary president's mind under strain. But to those who believe in the mystical, they appear as warnings, signs of a fate already sealed, glimpses into the future that he could neither prevent nor escape. Meanwhile, the movements of the Order of the Golden Circle grew more ominous. Pinkerton reports from April 1865 mentioned the Order's preparations for what they called a great sacrifice. In one intercepted letter, a chilling phrase appeared: "The circle will be completed in Washington." Did Lincoln's dreams mirror his fears because he knew of such plots? Or did they carry a deeper meaning? Was he, in some sense, being drawn into the orbit of a ritual or design larger than politics? Mary Lincoln herself would later add another layer to the mystery. After his assassination, she claimed that just a week before the fateful night at Ford's Theater, her husband said to her, "I know I shall be killed, but it will not be by chance. It will be the end of a long plan." Those words sound like a verdict, an acknowledgement that his life struggle was not just against rebellious states, but against an invisible power, a hidden hand reaching for him through the shadows. If that is true, then the forces arrayed against him, the Order of the Golden Circle, the underground lodges, the whispers in Washington's corridors, were not simply political adversaries. They were something greater, something older, something that believed sacrifice itself had power. And if Booth was only the man who pulled the trigger, then the true architects of Lincoln's death may never have stood on any stage. They may have been in the shadows all along, cloaked not in theater costumes, but in symbols, circles, and secrets. In the next chapter, We will unravel how the Order of the Golden Circle and allied Masonic lodges intersected in the conspiracy, and why the name of John Wilkes Booth may be nothing more than the mask for a far darker story. In the official version of history, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln is presented as the act of a single man, John Wilkes Booth, the Southern sympathizing actor turned fanatic. Yet documents and testimonies that surface decades later suggest a very different story. Booth was no lone wolf. He was part of a tightly bound group of 9 men who plotted not only Lincoln's murder, but a simultaneous strike against Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William Seward. The plan was audacious: to decapitate the Union government in a single night, sow chaos, and give the South one final chance to reclaim power. The official investigation acknowledged Booth and his closest associates, but what it never recorded in its trial transcripts were the words they spoke to one another in secret. Those words appear in a report filed by a Pinkerton agent who had infiltrated Washington's shadowy circles. His account is chilling. They swore on blood. They did not call themselves brothers, but sons of the circle. Their symbol was drawn upon the wall, a circle divided into 4. They said the president's death would complete an oath made many years ago. This language did not fit the narrative of a desperate conspiracy hatched in the last days of war. Ritual symbols, blood oaths, the invocation of the circle, all of it pointed toward links with the Knights of the Golden Circle and the clandestine lodges that had long operated in the South. Some researchers claim Booth was never just an actor. His father, Junius Brutus Booth, was a Mason. The family's social ties included men involved in occult practices and secret brotherhoods. Was it coincidence, or had Booth been raised within a world that prepared him for his role? After the assassination, investigators searched the boarding house of Mary Surratt, one of Booth's conspirators. Among her papers, they found a sheet covered in symbols. At its center was the familiar image, a circle quartered by a cross. Officially, the evidence was marked of no significance. Yet those who saw it insisted it was the mark of a cult. Other fragments strengthened the suspicion. Surviving letters from Booth contain cryptic phrases: "I am only part of a greater work. When the circle is complete, my role is ended." Most of these lines never appeared in public records. They were quietly filed away or destroyed. The trial of the conspirators was swift, staged more for display than truth. 4 were hanged, the rest imprisoned. Few dared ask whether these 9 were true architects or merely pawns in a deeper game. And then there is the body. When Booth was cornered and killed 12 days after the assassination, his family insisted the corpse was not his. In Southern newspapers, rumors spread like wildfire. "Booth lives. He has gone to his brothers." Who were those brothers? When the fragments are assembled, a darker picture emerges. Lincoln did not die at the hands of a lone zealot. His death was the culmination of a conspiracy, years in the making, in which the Knights of the Golden Circle, Masonic lodges, and hidden societies intertwined. Which brings us to the ultimate question: why? Why would such forces wish to eliminate Abraham Lincoln? The answer may lie not only in politics or slavery, but in something stranger. Booth and his companions spoke of an oath. They spoke of completing the circle. For them, Lincoln's death was not simply an assassination. It was the fulfillment of a ritual. In the next chapter, we will examine the evidence suggesting that Lincoln's murder carried not just political weight, but mystical significance, a sacrifice meant to seal a covenant hidden deep in America's secret history. The official history tells us that on April 14, 1865, inside Ford's Theater, the actor John Wilkes Booth fired a single shot into President Lincoln, and that was the end of the story. But if one looks deeper, The coincidences of that evening seem far too deliberate to dismiss as chance. First, the choice of venue. Ford's Theater was not the most fashionable in Washington, yet according to police reports from 1864, its back rooms had hosted clandestine meetings of Southern sympathizers and former members of the Knights of the Golden Circle. Several witnesses later claimed they had seen circle signs marked on the walls there. Second, the date. April 14th, Good Friday, the very day associated with sacrifice and death. The conspirators surely knew that striking on this date would carry not just political, but symbolic weight, resonating like a ritual offering. Third, the act itself. Booth fired a single shot into the back of Lincoln's head at the precise moment when the audience was laughing at a line in the comedy. It was not only an assassination, it was a theatrical gesture, a staged ritual. Booth knew his words would echo through the hall. He shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis!" Thus always to tyrants. Yet some witnesses swore he uttered more than that. A few claimed they heard him speak another, unfamiliar Latin phrase, later interpreted by scholars as part of a Masonic oath. Coincidence? Or had Booth recited a vow learned long before the night of the shooting? There is also the matter of Booth's ring. On his hand, he reportedly wore a gold band engraved with the symbol of a circle divided into 4 parts. After his death, the ring disappeared from the official inventory of his possessions. Was it an ornament or the emblem of an order? Then comes the most chilling discovery. In the surviving archives of the Surratt family, whose boarding house had been the conspirators' base, a single sheet was found. On it, a circle, 4 dots, and beside them, the initials AL. Some researchers believe it was a sacrifice chart, placing Abraham Lincoln at its center. The logic of the plot seems to align with this. The goal was not simply to eliminate the president, but to decapitate the Union government itself. Yet Lincoln's death was singled out as unique. He had to die not in private, but in the theater, in the presence of hundreds of witnesses, his blood becoming the final act of the war. And when we recall the entries from Robert Hill's diary, Taylor's aide who wrote of children in the circle decades earlier, the pattern becomes darker. Lincoln, too, appears as a figure drawn into the same tradition. Presidents ensnared by an oath whispered in shadows. Even the aftermath carries symbolic echoes. Lincoln was carried across the street, into the Peterson House, where he died at dawn on April 15th. In Catholic tradition, that was the very day when the rites of Holy Week concluded. To skeptics, these are coincidences. To others, they are evidence of a carefully staged ritual. When his body was prepared for burial, one servant later claimed he saw a faint mark upon the president's forehead, the imprint of a circle. Officially, nothing was said. But the rumor spread quickly through Washington, and with it came another. That Lincoln had not been merely the victim of a fanatic, but the final offering in an oath sworn long before in the era of Zachary Taylor. Thus, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln becomes not only a national tragedy, but the culmination of a hidden story, one in which politics and mysticism converged into a single, inexorable ritual. After Lincoln's assassination, Washington descended into chaos. The nation, barely emerging from the horrors of the Civil War, now faced a new kind of trauma. The president was dead. The conspiracy was exposed. Yet the questions that lingered were no fewer than those that had existed before. The official story insists that John Wilkes Booth was killed 12 days later in Virginia, cornered in a burning barn. His body was brought to Washington and buried in secrecy. But doubts arose almost immediately. Relatives claimed the body was not his. Newspapers published rumors that Booth had escaped south, then to Canada, even across the Atlantic to Europe. Alleged sightings of him appeared decades later. Coincidence? Or did the Order of the Golden Circle help him vanish into the shadows? The other conspirators faced swift judgment. 4 were executed, including Mary Surratt, the boarding house owner where the plotters met. Her death marked the first execution of a woman in U.S. history. Yet the strangeness lies in what disappeared before the trial even began. Many documents seized from her home were destroyed. Among them, witnesses later recalled, was a sheet marked with the circle's symbols. Why did those papers vanish? Why was no one allowed to speak of them in court? Others were condemned to life sentences. But even here, anomalies multiplied. One conspirator, Edmund Spangler, died suddenly in prison. The official cause? Lung disease. Yet his cellmates swore that the night before he had whispered, "I told too much about the circle. Now they will come for me." Another, Lewis Powell, the man who attacked Secretary Seward, spoke strange words on the eve of his execution. "I did not choose the victim. The victim was chosen for me." His statement was dismissed as the rambling of a doomed man. But what if it was the truth? The greatest mystery surrounds the fate of the Pinkerton files. The famed detective agency had infiltrated Washington's conspiratorial networks. Their reports described not only Booth and his accomplices, but connections to Masonic symbols, to the Order of the Golden Circle, to the possibility that Lincoln's assassination was not merely political, but ritualistic. And yet, by the late 19th century, a significant portion of these documents had vanished. Historian Otto Iverson, who worked with the Pinkerton archives in the 1920s, claimed he once saw a sealed report stamped confidential. In it, he said, were the words, "The president's death bore the character of a rite. Evidence exists of the influence of secret societies. Further investigation is prohibited." That report has never been seen again. In the end, the plotters were punished, but the network remained in the shadows. Those who might have known more died under suspicious circumstances. Those who could have spoken fell silent. And this silence created new questions. If Booth was merely a pawn, who stood above him? If the Order of the Golden Circle was truly tied to the assassination, why did none of its leaders ever face retribution? No answer has ever emerged, but every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. Lincoln's death did not end their story. It opened a new chapter. In the next section, we will examine how the secret societies exploited Lincoln's death, and why his assassination became, for them, the symbol of a circle completed. After Lincoln's death, America drowned in mourning. His funeral train passed through multiple states. Millions lined the streets to bid farewell to the fallen president. For the people, he became a martyr. But for the secret societies of the 19th century, his death carried a very different meaning. In the archives of a Masonic lodge in Louisville, discovered only in the 20th century, researchers uncovered a meeting protocol dated June 1865. It contained the chilling words, "The great sacrifice has been made. The circle is complete. The union renewed with blood." Historians still struggle to explain this fragment. Some dismiss it as forgery. Yet, if it is authentic, then Lincoln's death was interpreted not as an assassination, but as a ritual sacrifice, an offering to complete an oath whispered long before the Civil War. The Order of the Golden Circle, though broken as a political force after the Confederacy's collapse, survived in the shadows. In the 1870s, Southern newspapers occasionally reported on gatherings of former knights, nocturnal meetings where members spoke of the circle's legacy. Witnesses claimed that on the walls of such halls, the old symbols reappeared, a circle divided into 4 parts. But why Lincoln? Why was he chosen as their sacrifice? The answer may lie in his politics. Lincoln shattered the dream of a slaveholding empire. the very goal for which the order had been founded. More than that, he spoke openly of human equality. For those whose wealth and power had been built on chains and blood, Lincoln was not just an enemy. He was the destroyer of their world. His elimination, then, was not simply the killing of a president. For them, it was the restoration of balance, the fulfillment of an oath, the closing of a circle begun decades earlier. By the late 19th century, the circle's symbolism began to appear elsewhere. In the records of a New Orleans lodge, one passage reads, "Every age demands its sacrifice. The sons of the circle continue the work. We shall preserve the blood of the great within our bonds." The phrase, "the blood of the great," has disturbed researchers ever since. Did it mean these societies saw themselves as guardians of presidential bloodlines? Or did it mean something darker, that they chose, generation after generation, who would die and who would be sanctified as a symbol? Some scholars argue that after the Civil War, the order transformed, merging with other secret networks, Masonic lodges, political clubs, occult brotherhoods. Out of this mixture grew a shadowed tapestry in which Lincoln's death was no accident, but a precedent, a ritual etched into the tradition of hidden power. And perhaps that is why, decades later, echoes resurfaced. In the early 20th century, during a gathering in Texas, a transcript contained the words, "As with Lincoln, so shall others fall." The pattern became difficult to ignore. After Lincoln came Garfield, then McKinley, then Kennedy. Presidents struck down, their deaths accompanied by whispers of conspiracies and secret hands. For the American people, Lincoln was the martyr president, the savior of the Union. For secret societies, he became something else entirely, a seal, a sacrifice, the completion of a circle. Perhaps that is why his spirit still lingers in America's memory, not only as the great emancipator, but as a victim, one whose death was not only history's tragedy, but also part of a hidden war that continues to haunt the nation. After the execution of Lincoln's conspirators, it seemed that the story was finished. America tried to heal the wounds of the Civil War and move forward. But rumors and legends lived on, quietly shaping the shadows of history. In 1881, when President James Garfield was shot, strange parallels emerged once again. One eyewitness claimed that shortly before the attack, he saw a symbol scrawled on the wall of Washington's train station, a circle divided into 4 parts. Few paid attention, but a brief mention of the sign of the circle appeared in the Washington Star. 2 decades later, in 1901, President William McKinley was assassinated, and again, whispers of an invisible hand surfaced. In the archives of a New York Masonic lodge, researchers later found a cryptic entry. "The great sacrifice is renewed. The empire continues its path." The phrasing echoed ominously with the lodge notes from 1865 after Lincoln's death. But the most unsettling connections appeared in the 20th century. In 1963, after the assassination of John F. Kennedy in Dallas, conspiracy researchers revisited the archives and discovered a disturbing pattern. Nearly every president who had been assassinated, or even targeted, was linked to reform, equality, or structural change. They all sought to break old orders, and they all became victims of conspiracies that were never fully solved. It was then that researchers revived the specter of Lincoln and the Order of the Golden Circle. Some claimed the conspiracy did not die in the 19th century. It transformed, shed old faces, and reappeared under new names, but preserved its symbols and rituals. A chilling piece of evidence came from Louisiana, a document dated 1935, belonging to a little-known group called the Society of the Brothers of Light, which held its meetings in New Orleans. The text read, "The circle is never broken. From Taylor to Lincoln, from Garfield to Kennedy. We choose those who threaten our order. Their blood feeds the Union. Historians remain divided on whether this document is authentic or a hoax. Yet the mere fact of its discovery fueled dozens of theories. What if Lincoln's death was not an isolated tragedy, but the opening chapter of a chain? What if the circle symbol was not a myth, but a genuine mark of a network that for centuries selected its victims from among American presidents? By the 1970s, when Lincoln's body was exhumed once more to confirm his identity, newspapers whispered about strange marks found on the burial cloth. No details were ever given, but the rumors spread like wildfire. Even today, on the fringes of conspiracy forums, one can find the same claim repeated. Lincoln's assassination was the beginning of the so-called presidential curse, a string of deaths and attacks that continues into the modern age. Coincidence? Or the lingering hand of a society born in the 19th century, still weaving its secret pattern into the highest offices of the nation? For the nation, his death was a tragedy. For the people, he became a martyr, a symbol of freedom and unity. But for those who moved in the shadows, his death was something else, part of a ritual, a single link in a chain stretching through the history of America. Today we are taught to see Booth's plot as a local act of revenge carried out by fanatics. But documents, diaries, and lost reports suggest otherwise. Lincoln confronted an invisible network, the Order of the Golden Circle, Masonic lodges, secret societies whose goals went far beyond politics. Their language was symbols, their strength was ritual, their sacrifices were precedents. Lincoln was not the first, and he was not the last. His death seemed to open a new cycle. Garfield, McKinley, Kennedy. Each of them tried to transform the country, each of them challenged the old order, and each of them fell. Coincidence? Or the continuation of the circle so often mentioned in the writings of the 19th century? In partially released archives, one chilling line survived. America does not belong to those who elect her. She belongs to those who guard her blood. Who wrote these words remains unknown, but they echo through the diaries of Lincoln's aides, through Booth's letters, through the records of hidden orders. This is why the assassination of Lincoln still haunts us. We know the names of the plotters, we know the date and the place, but we do not know the most important truth: who was really behind them. Perhaps it was the order, vanishing into the smoke of history. Perhaps it was something older, wearing the mask of political clubs. But one thing is undeniable. Every time America loses a leader to an assassin's bullet, the shadow of Lincoln rises again, a reminder that his death was not chance. It was a symbol, and if the circle truly exists, then it has never been broken. It only waits for the next victim. If you found this story chilling and thought-provoking, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Your support helps uncover more hidden pieces of history. Imagine this: the most important speech in American history vanishes. Words spoken once, never written down, never recorded, and those who heard them seem to share an unspoken pact: silence. Abraham Lincoln is remembered as a man of words. His Gettysburg Address, just 2 minutes long, is immortalized in history books as a pinnacle of oratory. His inaugural speeches are studied, quoted, and inscribed in stone. Every phrase, every line has been preserved, analyzed, and reprinted hundreds of times. Every speech except one. In May of 1856, in the modest town of Bloomington, Illinois, Abraham Lincoln delivered an address that witnesses later called the most passionate, the most powerful, and the most unsettling of his entire career. Those who sat in that crowded hall claimed it shook them to their very core. Men said they had never seen him so consumed by fire, so overcome with a vision that bordered on the prophetic. But the text of this speech does not exist. No transcript survived. No journalist captured its words. And the newspapers, which typically reprinted political speeches in painstaking detail, all offered the same cryptic line. Mr. Lincoln's speech was unreportable. That was it. Nothing more. How is that possible? How could America allow the words of the man who would one day save the Union to vanish into nothing? Historians have debated for over a century. Some argue the speech was simply too radical, too dangerous. It might have split the country apart years before the Civil War. Others suggest it was prophetic, its words too dark, too accurate, a prediction of the bloodshed to come. And there is another theory, far more unsettling, that the speech did not simply disappear. It was deliberately erased. It was silenced because Lincoln said something no future American citizen was meant to hear. From that day forward, what came to be known as the lost speech of Abraham Lincoln has haunted scholars, politicians, and ordinary citizens alike. It is one of the great mysteries of the 19th century, an empty space in history where words should have been. So what truly happened in Bloomington that spring night? To understand, we must step back into the America of 1856, a nation teetering on the edge of collapse. Slavery divided the land like a wound that refused to heal. Congress had become a battlefield, with brawls and fistfights erupting on the floor of the House. The Kansas-Nebraska Act had inflamed the country, allowing slavery to spread westward, and with it came bloodshed. Newspapers carried stories of settlers murdering one another in what came to be called Bleeding Kansas. In that chaos, a new political movement was forming, the Republican Party. It was young, untested, and desperate for leaders who could speak with authority. The Bloomington Convention was its first great gathering in Illinois. It was supposed to be routine, delegates, speeches, resolutions. But then Lincoln rose to speak. Witnesses said the atmosphere in the hall changed instantly. He was not reading from notes. He spoke from memory, from passion, as though something had seized him. He condemned slavery not as a political issue, but as a moral poison that threatened to destroy the soul of the nation. He denounced corruption, cowardice, and compromise. He warned that America could not remain half slave and half free, a declaration that would later define his presidency. Men sat frozen. Some wept. Some shouted with approval. Others left the hall in silence, shaken by what they had heard. One reporter would later write, "It was as if a prophet had spoken. The air itself seemed charged with electricity. And yet, when the newspapers went to press, there was nothing. No quotations, no excerpts, no fragments. Just the strange line. Unreportable. Why? One explanation is fear. The country was already cracking under the strain of slavery. To print Lincoln's words might have ignited violence, not just in Kansas, but across the entire Union. Editors may have agreed, consciously or unconsciously, to suppress them. Another explanation is conspiracy. Some scholars believe powerful men in both parties saw Lincoln's words as too dangerous, too incendiary, and worked to ensure that no written record survived. If so, they succeeded. And then there are those who whisper of something darker, that Lincoln himself said things so unthinkable, so far beyond politics, that even his allies vowed never to repeat them. A glimpse, perhaps, of the bloody road ahead, or of forces at work that the public could not be allowed to know. Whatever the truth, one fact is undeniable. The lost speech marked a turning point. After Bloomington, Lincoln was no longer just a lawyer or a regional politician. He became a national figure, a man whose voice could shape destiny. And yet the very words that lifted him to that place remain hidden, lost in silence. So we are left with questions. What did Abraham Lincoln truly say on that May evening? Why did those who heard him agree to forget? And most of all, what truth was so powerful that history itself had to erase it? This is where our investigation begins. To grasp the true power of Abraham Lincoln's lost speech, we must first understand the America in which it was delivered. A country balanced on the edge of an abyss. The year was 1856. The United States was not one nation, but two halves pulling violently apart. In the South, slavery was not just an institution, it was the very foundation of the economy. Plantation owners insisted that without enslaved labor, the entire system of cotton, rice, and tobacco would collapse. For them, slavery was not a moral question, but a matter of survival. In the North, however, abolitionist movements were rising with unprecedented force. Newspapers printed searing accounts of the cruelty inflicted on enslaved men, women, and children. Stories of daring escapes through the Underground Railroad filled the public imagination. Anti-slavery rallies and fiery sermons thundered through city streets, sometimes spilling into riots. America was living in a state of constant agitation, where every headline seemed to bring the nation closer to collapse. It was in this volatile climate that a new political force emerged, the Republican Party. Born out of the ruins of failed coalitions, it gathered under one banner those who opposed the spread of slavery into new territories. The stakes were nothing less than the future itself. Every new state added to the Union threatened to tip the balance of power in Congress. Would the United States expand as a free nation, or would the shadow of slavery stretch westward, binding the entire continent in chains? Against this backdrop, in Illinois, a political convention was called. It was not yet the mighty Republican machine that would dominate American politics in decades to come. In 1856, it was still an experiment, a coalition of farmers, small-town lawyers, preachers, reformers, and minor politicians. Yet the atmosphere inside carried the weight of destiny. Everyone knew they were not just debating candidates, but deciding the very idea of what America would become. The gathering took place in Bloomington, in an aging wooden courthouse. The setting was modest, but the energy was electric. The hall was overcrowded. Men squeezed onto benches, filled every aisle, and climbed onto windowsills just to glimpse the proceedings. Witnesses recalled the room was suffocating with heat and tension, the kind of pressure that could ignite at the slightest spark. It was here that a tall, awkward figure stepped forward, a man known until then mostly within the borders of Illinois. Abraham Lincoln, the lanky lawyer from Springfield, with his deep-set eyes and solemn expression. He had debated in the state legislature, spoken on local stages, and earned a modest reputation as a skilled orator. But to most, he was still a regional figure, a politician of limited consequence. No one yet imagined that this moment would alter the course of his life, and perhaps the destiny of the nation. When Lincoln rose to the podium, the restless murmur of the crowd faded into silence. Observers later recalled that something changed in that instant. He did not appear as a provincial attorney, nor as a cautious party delegate. He looked, they said, like a man compelled by fate itself, a man about to give voice to the fears and hopes everyone felt, but few dared to speak aloud. What began as a routine political address quickly transformed into something else entirely. Eyewitnesses spoke of his voice deepening, of his words gaining rhythm and fire, as though the speech were less an argument than a revelation. He attacked slavery not as a political inconvenience, but as a moral cancer that threatened to poison the entire republic. He spoke of freedom not as a slogan, but as the true soul of America, imperiled by compromise and cowardice. Men in the audience later confessed that they sat transfixed, trembling, unable to look away. Some wept openly, Others shouted an affirmation. Still others walked out, unable to endure the intensity. It was not just a speech, it was an event, a moment that seared itself into memory. And yet, when the night ended, no words remained. Not a single transcript was made. Not one reporter copied the lines into his notebook. The newspapers the next day, instead of quoting Lincoln as they would with any other politician, published the same strange phrase. Mr. Lincoln's speech was unreportable. Unreportable. A word that has haunted historians ever since. Did it mean that the speech was so powerful no shorthand could capture it? Did it mean the content was too dangerous to print? Or did it mean something more deliberate, that a decision had been made by those in attendance to let the words vanish into silence? Whatever the reason, history records that on that night, Abraham Lincoln crossed a threshold. He was no longer simply a lawyer or a state politician. He became, in the eyes of those present, something larger, a figure whose voice could define the age. And yet the very words that elevated him remain hidden, lost in the shadows of memory. And so the mystery begins. The lost speech of Abraham Lincoln was not just a moment of forgotten rhetoric. It was a turning point at the edge of a divided America. A speech too powerful to be written down. A speech that, even now, we are left only to imagine. There are speeches that pass politely, listened to out of courtesy. There are speeches that end with ritual applause, hands clapping more out of habit than conviction. But then there are speeches that transform a room, speeches after which nothing feels the same. Bloomington, Illinois, in May 1856, witnessed such a speech. When Abraham Lincoln began, his voice was quiet, measured, almost hesitant. At first, he seemed the small-town lawyer he had always been. But as he spoke, something shifted. The timbre of his voice deepened. His words grew sharper, heavier. His tall, awkward frame seemed to rise higher, as though the man himself was being carried by the force of his own conviction. His long arms cut through the air, punctuating every phrase. Witnesses recalled that midway through the speech, the audience was no longer simply attentive. It was spellbound, as if caught in a kind of trance. Fragments of testimony survive. One listener wrote, "We could not take our eyes from him. It was as if Lincoln's words burned into us. He spoke as though he saw the future, and that future was terrifying." Another said, "Men cried. Hardened veterans, men who had faced musket fire, wept openly. We applauded until our hands were numb." Some described the sensation not in political terms, but almost in spiritual ones. They felt an energy coursing through the room, as though Lincoln was less a man delivering an argument and more a vessel through which something larger was speaking. The speech lasted more than an hour. He ranged across every subject: the spread of slavery, the looming fracture of the Union, the moral responsibility of citizens, and the shadow of civil war gathering on the horizon. Lincoln declared that America faced a choice: to preserve its soul by rejecting slavery, or to lose it forever by bowing to fear and greed. And then there were the darker passages, the words that most disturbed those who heard them. One eyewitness swore Lincoln warned of a coming fire that shall sweep the land. Another remembered him speaking of rivers that would run red with blood. At one point he declared, "A people who hold another in chains shall one day find themselves bound in chains as well." The hall erupted in waves of emotion. Some leapt from their seats, shouting in affirmation. Others pressed forward, as though desperate to touch him, as if proximity to the speaker might anchor them to the power in his words. A kind of ecstasy gripped the room, a mingling of dread, awe, and unshakable conviction. Yet when it was over, the silence in the written record was absolute. Not a single reporter transcribed the words. No stenographer preserved a copy. The newspapers that normally relished quoting political speeches in detail wrote only a single enigmatic line. Mr. Lincoln's speech was so powerful that it could not be reported. Couldn't be reported. The phrase has haunted generations of historians. Was it simply shorthand, meaning the speech was too emotional to capture? Or was it something else, a deliberate choice to withhold? It was not as though the press lacked skill. In the 1850s, newspapers thrived on reproducing speeches, debates, and addresses verbatim. Yet in this one case, this single speech that witnesses swore was the most passionate Lincoln ever gave, there is nothing. Only memories, hazy and secondhand, and the echo of words too sharp, perhaps, to survive on paper. The question remains even now. What did Lincoln actually say that night? What words were so fierce, so prophetic, that not a single hand dared to set them down in ink? Was it fear of controversy, a pact of silence, or a recognition that the nation, already trembling on the brink, could not bear to see those words in print? Whatever the truth, one fact is certain. Those who left the courthouse in Bloomington that night carried with them the weight of something unforgettable. They swore that they had seen a man transformed, a prophet of a storm still to come. And yet, history remains empty-handed. The lost speech survives not in parchment or ink, but only in memory, scattered fragments of awe and fear, leaving us with a mystery that has endured for more than a century and a half. The story of Abraham Lincoln is unusually well documented. Every major speech he delivered, every letter he wrote, every note scribbled in the margins of a draft, preserved. His debates, his inaugural addresses, his Gettysburg words, all survive in ink and paper. All but one. One speech is missing. Not a fragment. Not a single line remains. As if it never existed. In May of 1856, in Bloomington, Illinois, the hall was filled with delegates, citizens, and, most importantly, journalists. There were reporters from Chicago, St. Louis, Springfield, men accustomed to transcribing every syllable of political life. Their job was to capture, with precision, the pulse of American democracy. And yet, when it came to Abraham Lincoln's address that day, every one of them wrote the same evasive phrase: "Mr. Lincoln's speech cannot be reported." It sounded less like an observation and more like an excuse. The question is, why? The first explanation is the simplest. The speech was so passionate, so electrifying, that the reporters simply could not keep up. The words came too quickly. The emotion was too raw. The hall too chaotic. But this theory does not stand up to scrutiny. Even the most fiery oration leaves traces. Mid-19th century stenographers were remarkably skilled, capable of writing at astonishing speed. And Lincoln's address lasted for over an hour. To suggest that no one could record even fragments strains belief. A second theory is that Lincoln himself forbade transcription. Perhaps he wanted his words to remain within the walls of Bloomington, spoken once and then gone. But this too clashes with his character. Lincoln was a politician, one who understood the power of print. He wanted his words to travel, to reach farms, towns, and cities far beyond the sound of his voice. Why would he, of all men, demand silence? That leaves the third explanation, the most unsettling of all. The text was deliberately suppressed, not by Lincoln, but by those around him. According to this view, his speech was too radical, too incendiary, too dangerous to be released. The Republican Party in 1856 was fragile, still new, still trying to present itself as respectable to a divided nation. A fiery denunciation of slavery, delivered in prophetic tones, might have set the country ablaze years before the Civil War. There are clues that support this darker theory. Even Lincoln's closest allies, who were present at Bloomington, later avoided recounting his exact words. They admitted the speech was extraordinary, unforgettable, perhaps the greatest they had ever heard. And yet, when pressed, they offered only vague praise, never a quotation. The silence spreads across the record like a shadow. Dozens of journalists in attendance, yet none published notes. Hundreds of citizens heard it, yet not one diary entry captures its lines. And perhaps most suspicious of all, newspapers that initially promised to print Lincoln's remarks abruptly reversed course. By early June of 1856, editorials that hinted at forthcoming transcripts were replaced by bland summaries of the convention, stripped of Lincoln's fire. It was as if some invisible hand had intervened, ordering the erasure of his words. Thus was born the legend of Lincoln's lost speech. It is more than an historical curiosity. It is a hole in the American record, a silence where there should be sound, a void where there should be ink. It leaves us with haunting questions. What did Lincoln say that day in Bloomington? Did he predict the coming war with a clarity that frightened even his allies? Did he condemn slavery in terms so absolute that they threatened to splinter his still fragile party? Or did he speak of something more dangerous still? Truths about America that its leaders were not yet ready to confront. Nearly 2 centuries later, no definitive answer exists. The transcripts remain missing, the notes destroyed or never written, the echoes fading. What survives are only testimonies of awe, fragments of memory, and the persistent, troubling silence that follows whenever truth is too dangerous to speak aloud. The lost speech remains a ghost in American history, a moment that shook its witnesses to the core, and yet has been denied to every generation since. When words vanish, whispers take their place, and sometimes whispers carry more power than any written record. After the Bloomington Convention, stories of Lincoln's speech spread across Illinois and into neighboring states. But they were not consistent. Each account described something different, and each version seemed too bold, too dangerous, too radical to ever appear in a newspaper of the mid-19th century. The first version was political and uncompromisingly radical. According to this account, Lincoln declared openly that slavery was not merely a mistake, not merely a social ill to be reformed gradually, but a crime against the very foundation of the American Republic. A nation born in the name of liberty, he argued, had no right to exist, while millions remained in chains. For 1856, such a statement was not simply controversial, it was incendiary. It would have sounded like a declaration of war against the South and against half the United States Congress. The second version was prophetic. Witnesses later swore that Lincoln described a coming storm, a bloody war that would consume the continent. He spoke of a river that will run red with water and blood, of a fire that will sweep through the Republic. Some listeners insisted these were metaphors, powerful rhetoric meant to stir emotion. Others whispered that Lincoln had glimpsed the future itself, the coming Civil War, years before its first shots were fired. A third version was intimate, even mystical. According to certain rumors, Lincoln referred to his own destiny. He was said to have proclaimed, "I know how my path will end, but I am prepared to walk it for the sake of this country's future." No one dared write those words down. But years later, after his assassination in 1865, the phrase resurfaced, woven into the mythology of a leader who seemed to carry the shadow of fate with him. And then came the strangest version of all. In hushed voices, some claimed that Lincoln spoke of a dark brotherhood, hidden forces pulling the strings of politics behind closed doors. He warned, they said, that unless America cleansed itself, it would become a victim of these invisible powers. Historians dismiss this as pure invention, a later conspiracy imposed onto the silence of the record. Yet the idea stuck. The lost speech became a vessel into which every fear and suspicion of the age could be poured. Different as these rumors were, they all shared one element: danger. Lincoln's words, whatever they were, gave no one the safety of neutrality. He drew lines. He forced choices. He made it impossible to sit in silence. And that, perhaps, is precisely why the speech disappeared. But the mystery deepens. Years later, some who had been in the hall admitted something unsettling. They had not forgotten the words. They had chosen not to record them. One delegate recalled being quietly advised by party leaders not to take notes. Another claimed that the press had been urged to remain vague for the good of the cause. A few even suggested that silence was a patriotic duty, that to print Lincoln's words would ignite chaos before the nation was ready to face it. Thus, the silence wasn't accidental. It was deliberate, a collective decision made by men who believed that suppressing truth was safer than revealing it. And it is within this silence, between official history and the fragmented memories of eyewitnesses, that the greatest intrigue resides. What exactly did Abraham Lincoln say that was so powerful, so dangerous, that even his closest allies preferred to erase it rather than preserve it? The lost speech remains suspended in that gap, between the echoes of what was heard and the shadows of what was deliberately forgotten. Sometimes truth slips away from the newspapers, but lingers in the minds of people. And if we gather these fragments, we might hear the echo of that speech. Decades after the Bloomington Convention, a few men finally dared to share their memories. Their accounts did not always align. Some contradicted each other. Yet a common thread ran through them all. Each spoke of a strange power that seemed to radiate from Abraham Lincoln that night. In the 1870s, Charles Ray, a former delegate at the convention, wrote in his diary, "Never before or since have I witnessed anything like it." Lincoln spoke as though he already knew the future. His voice trembled as he spoke of division, of war. He said that unless slavery was destroyed, God himself would destroy us. These were not mere words. They were prophecy. Another witness, journalist John Moore, described the same night in a private letter. That evening, we thought we saw fire in his eyes. He spoke of blood that would wash away the sins of America. He said those who profited from slavery would one day pay with their own children. The most unsettling recollection comes from William Harding, a minor activist whose notes were not discovered until the 1920s. In his journal, he wrote, "Lincoln said his words must not be written down. He said they would be understood too soon, and the nation would tear itself apart before it was ready. He asked us to remain silent, and we obeyed." These testimonies present a paradox. On the one hand, Lincoln himself may have asked that no record be kept. On the other, his words sound uncannily like predictions of his own fate and of the war that would engulf the nation. Was it caution, or was it prophecy? But the fragments hold yet another element, mentioned again and again. Witnesses recalled that Lincoln's words were not only about slavery, they hinted at something larger, something hidden. He spoke, they said, of forces beneath the surface, of unseen powers that manipulated the country, of dangers not obvious to the eye, but rotting America from within. One delegate later confessed, "We felt that we were not the only ones in that hall. It was as if something invisible was listening with us. Perhaps it was only metaphor, the sense of a man channeling the spirit of history itself. But in the context of America in the mid-19th century, those words acquire a chilling weight. Within a few short years, the nation did indeed fall into fire and blood. and Lincoln himself would become its greatest victim. Thus, in the memories of those who were there, the lost speech ceased to be a speech at all. It became a myth, a moment suspended between history and legend, an event impossible to confirm, yet equally impossible to dismiss. And if we believe these fragments, if we grant them even a shadow of truth, then one conclusion emerges. Lincoln saw what was coming. He looked into the future, and, in Bloomington, he tried to warn America of the fate that awaited it. History, they say, is written by the victors. But sometimes history is erased, not by those who triumph, but by those who fear they are about to lose. When researchers try to understand why the text of Lincoln's lost speech never survived, nearly all arrive at the same unsettling thought. The silence was no accident. It was deliberate. It was organized. The Republican Party in 1856 was still in its infancy. To many delegates at the Bloomington Convention, Abraham Lincoln was a rising star, charismatic, sharp, and capable of stirring the hearts of ordinary people. But to others, he was also a threat. His fiery words about a looming war and about the cleansing of the nation through blood risked alienating moderates. The young party could not afford to brand itself as radical. Its leaders needed compromise, coalition, and cautious optimism, not visions of catastrophe. Some accounts suggest that immediately after the speech, party officials approached the reporters in attendance. They were told, in plain terms, not to write down the address and not to publish direct quotations. In return, they were promised access to exclusive stories, political favors, and privileged information in the years ahead. Most journalists, dependent on their connections and wary of losing influence, complied. Thus, the silence was secured. But there is a darker version of events. Some historians believe that Lincoln did more than denounce slavery. According to this view, his words reached into dangerous territory, subjects that few dared to touch in public during the mid-19th century. He may have spoken of the financial power of bankers, of the hidden influence of secret societies, and even of corruption within his own party. If true, such statements would have threatened not only Lincoln's personal career, but also the fragile architecture of power upon which the Republican Party hoped to build its future. Hints of this surface in unexpected places. Years later, archival fragments suggested that among the Bloomington delegates were members of Masonic lodges. Rumors circulated that Lincoln had dared to mention dark circles or hidden brotherhoods that kept nations in chains. In the political climate of the 1850s, such remarks would have been tantamount to suicide. Few men could have survived such candor in public, least of all a provincial lawyer still trying to establish himself on the national stage. So perhaps the silence was not simply strategic, it was protective. By erasing the speech, the party shielded Lincoln from his own intensity and itself from division. The lost speech disappeared not because it was forgotten, but because it was too dangerous to remember. And yet the mystery deepens. If it was only politics, why did witnesses decades later describe the moment in almost mystical terms? Why did they write of a strange energy in the room, of prophecy, of fire in Lincoln's eyes? Why did they recall not just a political address, but an experience that seemed larger than life? One cannot ignore the haunting detail repeated across testimonies, the sense that Lincoln's words carried more than political argument. They carried the weight of destiny. He spoke of slavery, yes, but also of something beyond slavery. He spoke of unseen chains, of hidden masters, of storms yet to come. And so the question lingers. Was the lost speech erased merely to protect a fragile party from scandal? Or was it buried because it contained truths too dangerous for America to face in 1856? Sometimes silence is louder than any speech. Sometimes it is precisely what we do not hear that shapes the future. After the Bloomington Convention, Abraham Lincoln quickly emerged as one of the central figures of the new Republican Party. His name began to circulate far beyond the borders of Illinois. Yet the strangest thing of all was that almost no one spoke openly about the very speech that had electrified the hall. It was as if there had been a collective effort not only to erase it from the newspapers, but to erase it even from memory. Politically, this silence brought Lincoln an unexpected advantage. Unlike the radicals, he carried no compromising quotations that could be used against him in print. His words lived only in the hearts of those who had been present, but not on the pages of the public record. That absence made him useful, charismatic, yet officially moderate. His reputation was that of a reasonable man, untainted by dangerous rhetoric. But there were other consequences. Those who had heard the speech never forgot it. For many of them, Bloomington became a kind of initiation, a moment of revelation. Years later, they still recalled the power of that night, and they followed Lincoln with unshakable loyalty. One delegate later wrote, "After Bloomington, I knew this man would lead us through the storm." We all knew it. And yet, the reverse was also true. Those who understood the full force of his words saw in Lincoln a threat. When he became president, his enemies often resurrected the ghost of Bloomington, accusing him of being always too radical, a man who had long spoken of war and blood. Thus, the vanished speech became a shadow, haunting him for the rest of his life. A speech that no one could quote, yet everyone remembered. There is also a symbolic dimension. Some historians argue that if the speech had been published in 1856, the nation might have been plunged into crisis immediately. The Civil War, they suggest, could have begun 5 years earlier. The fragile balance between North and South might have shattered long before Lincoln ever reached the White House. The fate of America itself might have taken a different path. Silence postponed the catastrophe, but it did not prevent it. The lost speech became an unheard warning, and when war finally came, many recalled that night. Lincoln told us then. He told us what was coming. History has strange laws. Sometimes the most important words remain in the shadows. Sometimes the absence of a text is more powerful than its presence. The Bloomington Address became precisely such an event, a paradox, a void that continues to draw speculation, reverence, and fear. And yet one question refuses to fade. If Lincoln's words were truly that powerful, if they shook men to tears and left them unable to sleep, then perhaps, just perhaps, someone, somewhere, tried to preserve them. A scrap of paper, a private diary, a memory guarded in silence. What if the speech was not entirely lost? What if fragments still survive, hidden in the margins of history, waiting to be uncovered? For decades, it was believed that Lincoln's lost speech had vanished without a trace. Historians, politicians, and the public all repeated the same refrain. No notes, no transcripts, nothing survived. And yet, as the years passed, fragments began to surface, scattered hints buried in archives, private diaries, and half-forgotten recollections of those who had been present in Bloomington that night. They were incomplete, inconsistent, sometimes dismissed as forgeries. But taken together, they form a ghostly echo of the words that once shook a room to its core. In the 1890s, researchers working in the Library of Congress uncovered a worn notebook belonging to a little-known delegate, William Clayton. Its pages were mostly filled with everyday jottings, but near the back, in a nervous, hurried script, were several cryptic lines. He said the Republic will be redeemed by fire. That slavery will fall, but with it will fall those who permitted its existence. Scholars debated whether these words referred to Lincoln's Bloomington Address or to another speech. Yet for many, This short entry became the closest thing to a surviving fragment of the lost speech itself. Another clue emerged in the correspondence of Joseph Medill, a journalist who had been in the room that day. Medill was one of the reporters who, in print, offered the enigmatic explanation: "Mr. Lincoln's speech cannot be rendered on paper." But decades later, in a private letter to a colleague, he confessed something very different. "I still hear his words. He said that God will demand full payment from this nation. That blood will flow, and we will not be able to stop it." It was as if Medill carried a burden all his life, unwilling to record the speech publicly, but unable to forget it privately. In the early 20th century, another curious scrap surfaced in the archives of the Bryant family. A short note, unsigned but attributed to a relative who had attended the convention, claimed, "Lincoln asked us not to write it down. But I remember he spoke of a brotherhood standing above the law, and that it was leading the nation into the abyss." To many scholars, this looked like a forgery, a sensational artifact created after Lincoln's death to stir interest. And yet the phrasing matched the darker rumors about the Bloomington speech, that Lincoln had alluded not only to slavery, but to hidden forces pulling the strings of American politics. No single testimony provides a complete picture. Each is fragmentary, ambiguous, and clouded by the decades that separated the memory from the event. But together, they begin to sketch an image, a speech that was at once a political manifesto, a prophetic warning, and a deeply personal confession. What is most striking, however, is the unifying theme that runs through every surviving trace, the theme of reckoning. Whether the fragments speak of divine judgment, national punishment, or the collapse of corrupt systems, they all point in the same direction. Lincoln, it seems, declared that the United States would be forced to pay for its sins, and that the price would be blood. To modern readers, these words sound almost too precise, too eerily aligned with the Civil War that would erupt just 5 years later. But for those in the 1850s, such language would have been incendiary, enough to brand Lincoln as a dangerous radical and to fracture a fragile political coalition. And so the question lingers. If these fragments are authentic, why were they not published even decades later, when the war was long past and Lincoln had become a martyr? Why did so many witnesses continue to guard their silence? Was it loyalty to Lincoln's own request? Fear of reopening old wounds? Or something darker? A deliberate effort by political elites to bury the parts of his message that went beyond slavery, touching upon secret powers and uncomfortable truths. The mystery of the lost speech is not only about what was said, it is about why, even after the blood of war had washed over the nation, America still was not ready to face those words. More than a century and a half later, Abraham Lincoln's lost speech remains one of the greatest enigmas in American history. For some historians, it was simply the fiery address of a young politician, erased for the sake of political compromise, forgotten so that the Republican Party could survive its fragile beginnings. For others, it was something far more disturbing, a warning, perhaps even a prophecy of the cataclysm to come, words so terrifying that they could not be preserved in memory, let alone in print. Whatever the truth, the silence surrounding it became part of the myth. Lincoln entered history as one of the greatest orators the United States ever produced. His Gettysburg Address, a mere 2 minutes long, is immortalized in textbooks. His inaugural speeches are quoted to this day. And yet, it is the one speech that was never written down, never recorded, that gives him an aura almost supernatural. It suggests that his words were not just eloquence, but a force, something that frightened even his allies and unsettled his enemies. For America, the lost speech became a symbol of uncomfortable truth, a truth that could be concealed but never destroyed. generations have returned to the question, what did he actually say in Bloomington? And with each generation, the question becomes less about history and more about the nature of power, prophecy, and the cost of silence. For Lincoln himself, the lost speech became a shadow. Those who had been in the room that day never forgot it, and they measured everything he said afterward against that memory. His later addresses, his moral convictions as president, his vision of a nation half slave and half free, all of it was refracted through the unspoken words of Bloomington. To his supporters, it was proof that he had seen the storm before it broke. To his detractors, it was evidence that he had always been too radical, too dangerous. And then came Ford's Theater, 1865. Lincoln's assassination gave the lost speech a darker resonance. Many could not help but believe that he had foretold not only the Civil War, but also his own death. The fragments, those haunting references to fire, to blood, to chains, seemed to align too perfectly with his fate. The silence, once political, now carried the weight of destiny. Today, the lost speech is not just an unsolved riddle for historians. It is a reminder of the extraordinary power of words. A reminder that sometimes one speech can change the course of a nation, or force a nation into silence. Perhaps this is its true legacy. Not the vanished text itself, but the silence it left behind. A silence that demands interpretation. A silence that still compels us to listen, to search, to wonder. Because in that silence, we continue to hear an echo. The echo of a tall, gaunt lawyer from Illinois, standing before a restless crowd in a wooden courthouse, speaking words that shook them to the core. Words that history could not capture. Words that still haunt America.